Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, from 1989. And this is continuing my series where on every Friday the 13th I release a review of a Friday the 13th film in the order that the films are released, and I'm up to Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. It's kind of notorious for being a pretty lousy Friday the 13th film, but it's also the final Friday the 13th film with Paramount Studios, although that has changed recently. It was the last one before it was sold to New Line Cinema, and it's also the last Friday the 13th film of the 80s. They had made 8 films in the 80s. The only 2 years where Friday the 13th film wasn't in theaters was 1983 and 1987, and they were a dominant horror franchise throughout the 80s. And I think when you think of Friday the 13th, you usually think of the 80s, since more Friday the 13th films were released during the 80s than any other decade. But I think mostly people dislike this film because the advertising was, the title of the film was Jason Takes Manhattan. The trailer was like, Jason's coming to New York. The poster, they had him ripping through the I Heart New York logo, which New York Tourism Board didn't like and actually had them stop doing after a certain point. They certainly strongly advertised it as Jason comes to New York. The tagline was, New York has a new problem. But since most of the film is really on a boat instead of Jason Takes Manhattan, like the title suggests, a boat with 2 horny teenagers getting it on, and they have a little montage of New York, but they quickly get rid of that, and they go to these teenagers who drop anchor in their boat. That's not a euphemism, but that would have been clever. And then they drag the anchor to an electrical line, which so happens to hit Jason's body, which was in the water from Part 7, A New Blood. And so then it electrocutes him and brings him back to life. And so he kills those teens, and he somehow gets on, finds the big boat that all these teens, these seniors who are graduating and going off to college, are doing a final boat trip, even though apparently they've actually already graduated, so why would they still be going to school events? They usually do that, but that's just semantics, really. But they go on this boat trip, and they're going on this boat trip to New York to see the sights, and then they go back to the kind of Crystal Lake area, although close to Camp Crystal Lake. But Jason is on the boat, and most of the film takes place on the boat, and they have to try to survive on the boat from Jason before he kills all the graduating seniors on the boat. A better title for this film would be Jason Out to Sea instead of Jason Takes Manhattan. That's kind of where the bad relationship comes from. But it's not like this is a good movie. The late 80s weren't the great period of horror that the early 80s were, and horror films were a lot worse in the later 80s. I get the impression that they were planning a different film. That's what Rob Heaton seems to suggest, that they wanted to have more and more of it shot in New York, but they kept cutting it down. Originally it was going to be 50%, then it became 30% New York, and there's like 15 minutes, and a lot of it looks like it was on a soundstage. I wish they'd maybe done more with it. That seems like a cool movie. They don't really always need to have teens involved. It felt like they're sticking too much to the Crystal Lake thing. He could have just got on a boat and then gone to Manhattan. We didn't really need to see that whole boat thing. And a lot of the kills aren't particularly great. I mean, there's one kill with the kid boxing Jason, which was actually originally supposed to happen at Madison Square Garden, which makes a little more sense, where he boxes Jason and Jason kind of does the rope-a-dope. That's probably my favorite kill of the whole film. But then there's a lot of characters who just suddenly are killed off screen. During the boat scene, one of the adult chaperones, which are only 2, which is pretty low for a senior class, but maybe it was a small school with bad funding, I don't know. But they did have a boat, so the teacher goes, I told some kids to wait in the restaurant. And he was like, oh, there's no restaurant anymore. And then that's it. We don't get to see them get killed. We don't get to see anything happen to them. Same with that exact teacher dies kind of in a car explosion, but you don't really actually see what happens. You know, for a film that's notorious for its crazy kills, it seems to not have as many, and it seems to actually be doing some off screen. Nothing in this film is really scary. There's no cool jump scares. Even as a goofy, dumb, bad 80s movie, it doesn't really succeed that much. It's just a bad 80s movie. It's a bad sequel. I have Jason on a boat. That concept seems horrible to me. Why would you want to have Jason on a boat? Take Jason to New York, do kind of an urban Jason movie. That is a twist on it, much like having a Psychic Girl or a funny Jason movie like Jason Lives. Certainly they were fresh out of ideas, but this is going more into like direct to DVD or direct to VHS at this time kind of territory. And I can understand why Paramount wanted to get rid of it, although I think socially they didn't find it acceptable, really. They were also a little embarrassed of it, so they just kind of sold it off to a studio like New Line, who was trashier and independent and thought they could do something with it, and they eventually did, but it took a couple of years. The potential for what Jason Takes Manhattan is pretty much why everyone sees it, but the actual film is fairly disappointing, like most horror sequels, or what we consider to be a bad horror sequel, and it is a bad horror sequel. It's cool that Jason kind of mined the same territory that the Muppets franchise did. The Muppets took Manhattan. They also went to space, much like Jason, and they were rebooted. So, if you think about it, they do have a lot of similarities, but unfortunately, Jason's Treasure Island never got off the ground. Some people kind of like this movie. I didn't mind New Blood that much. There's certain ones I like, a certain kill or I like a certain sequence, and this is just a bad movie. I mean, there's just no way around it. I think the studio executives didn't let them make the movie they were supposed to make, and I don't care about this girl who was drowned and like her principal dad thing that I don't really get. The dog disappeared and then reappeared a lot of times. Nothing to really pull me in, but I also think a big problem with this is it has such a large cast, but it's mostly about the girl. It should have mainly been about the girl instead of too many characters and too many plot lines to follow. I mean, there's the filmmaker kid, there was the ship captain's kid, there was the boxer guy, there was the slutty prom queen, there was a biologist girl played by Kelly Hu. This was, I think, Kelly Hu's first film from X-Men 2, and then later a voice on Phineas and Ferb. There's always been a lot of characters in Friday the 13th films, but there's no one to identify with. Also, none of the kills are fun, none of the scares are good, and it's just like kind of a bad, cheesy 80s film. This ship has everything from an 80s discotheque to a sauna. I mean, it goes the gamut on all these different kind of cliches. They're making a music video for no reason. This is just not an entertaining movie, and I think it's actually my least favorite Friday the 13th film. I think A New Chapter was a little more interesting. This is just disappointing. You have a kind of a cool sequence in Times Square. I like that it's older New York. Certainly at the time you don't get the thrill of seeing a New York that no longer exists. You're just seeing New York at the time, and it probably was even less interesting then. It's a little more interesting now because of time, but it hasn't aged any better, and it's not a good movie. I've seen 8 of the Friday the 13th films, and I'm sure it probably gets worse, but this is definitely my least favorite thus far. I can kind of understand why it was apparently the second lowest grossing of the Friday the 13th franchise, because it just frankly isn't very good and it's very disappointing. And if your friend was like, hey, did you see the new Friday the 13th? And you go, oh yeah, it's awful, they're barely in New York, and you're like, oh fuck that, I'm waiting for VHS, if I even see it. I don't like this movie, I don't recommend this movie, and I think it is certainly the weakest and worst made of all the Friday the 13th films I've seen so far, and I hope it doesn't get worse than this, but I'm pretty sure it does, unfortunately. I think this kind of starts out Friday the 13th's incredibly stupid period, and you're probably like, hasn't it been stupid before? This is obviously truly starting off a pretty stupid period for Friday the 13th films, but I'm hoping it gets better after this, but I guess I will see. So if you have seen Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And the next Friday the 13th is Friday, February 13th, 2015, and I will be doing Jason Goes to Hell. 2015 actually has 3 different Friday the 13ths in it, so I will be doing more Friday the 13th reviews that year than I certainly did this year, which is only been 1, but next year there will be 3, and actually 1 in February and 1 in March. Check out my playlist of all the previous Friday the 13th film reviews, and I hope to see you then, and thank you for watching.